In the quiet hours of a misty night in Brookdale, Washington, undercover investigator Elena Carter was heading home after weeks of painstaking surveillance. Her work within the Office of Institutional Integrity had led her deep into the underbelly of corruption infecting the local government. The operation was nearing its conclusion, and the evidence in her possession could expose a web of deceit that had long evaded justice. As Elena navigated the deserted suburban streets, she checked her rearview mirror, a habitual precaution. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she turned onto a familiar stretch of road. Suddenly, the glare of flashing blue and red lights flooded her mirrors. The piercing wail of a siren shattered the silence. Without hesitation, Elena signaled and pulled over, already anticipating the confrontation ahead. The police cruiser came to a stop behind her, its headlights illuminating the interior of her vehicle. Two uniformed officers emerged, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter, but with a watchful demeanor. The taller officer approached first, exuding an air of authority. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you know why we pulled you over?" Elena kept her expression neutral. "No, officer. I believe I was obeying all traffic laws." The officer, her name badge reading Keller, offered a condescending smile. "Actually, you failed to make a complete stop back at that intersection." Elena knew this was a fabrication. She had made a conscious effort to follow every regulation to the letter. Her instinct screamed that this was no routine stop. Keller gestured for her license and registration. Elena handed them over, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The shorter officer, identified as Hendricks, circled around the vehicle with apparent casualness, yet Elena could sense the tension in the air. A few moments later, Hendricks called out, "Hey, Keller, come take a look at this." Keller strode toward the back of the vehicle as Elena watched in measured silence. Hendricks lifted the trunk, and there, sitting conspicuously at the edge, was an unmarked manila envelope. "What do we have here?" Keller mused, retrieving the envelope and flipping it open. Inside, stacks of falsified financial records lay in clear view. Elena's jaw tightened. That envelope had not been in her trunk. She had meticulously secured her vehicle before leaving the office. The planting of evidence was a textbook setup. "Mind explaining this?" Keller asked, her smirk widening. Elena met her gaze without flinching. "I'll reserve my statements for an appropriate setting." Keller's smirk didn't waver. "Well, you'll have plenty of time to think about it. Step out of the vehicle." As the cold metal of handcuffs locked around her wrists, Elena knew the true battle had just begun. They thought they had her cornered, but she had spent years unraveling elaborate schemes. She wasn't about to let this be her downfall. The ride to the station was silent. The occasional crackle of the police radio was the only sound punctuating the thick tension. Elena sat motionless in the back seat, mentally cataloging every detail, every nuance that could later dismantle this charade. Inside the station, Keller and Hendricks paraded her past rows of desks, their smug satisfaction palpable. At the booking counter, Keller dropped the envelope onto the desk with a theatrical flourish. "Looks like we caught ourselves a real mastermind," she said, glancing at her colleagues for validation. Elena remained composed as she was processed. A young officer, her badge reading Grant, hesitated slightly as she recorded Elena's information. "Name? Elena Carter. Occupation? Consultant." Grant's brows furrowed slightly, but she said nothing as she completed the intake process. Minutes later, Elena was led to a dimly lit holding cell. The clang of the heavy door closing behind her did nothing to shake her resolve. Outside her cell, Keller leaned against the bars, arms crossed. "You don't look too worried." Elena tilted her head slightly. "Perhaps you should be." Keller's confident demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second before she scoffed and walked away. The moment she was alone, Elena subtly pressed against the hem of her jacket, activating the discreet tracker embedded within. It was only a matter of time before her team was alerted. Meanwhile, in another part of the station, Officer Grant sat at her desk, staring at Elena's arrest report. Something about the case didn't sit right. Grant's instincts, honed through years of observing patterns, told her to look deeper. Accessing archived records, she traced Keller and Hendricks' past arrests. A troubling pattern emerged, minor stops escalating into high-profile cases, with suspiciously well-timed discoveries of illicit materials. Unable to ignore her growing unease, Grant sought out her superior. "Sir, I think we need to review this case more closely." Her request was met with skepticism, but the weight of evidence compelled her superior to forward the matter to external oversight. Hours later, a fleet of unmarked vehicles arrived outside the precinct. Federal agents, led by Special Agent Dominic Reeves, entered with quiet authority. The station's air shifted as they made their way to the records room, where they swiftly secured Keller and Hendricks' case files. In the interrogation room, Reeves sat across from the two officers. "Care to explain how an envelope materialized in Miss Carter's vehicle?" Keller's smirk was gone. "We were securing evidence," she said stiffly. Reeves slid a folder across the table. "Funny, because our surveillance footage shows no such evidence existed before you opened the trunk." Hendricks' face paled as the weight of their actions settled in. Outside, Elena was released from her cell. As she stepped out, her eyes met Grant's. A nod of acknowledgement passed between them. By the end of the week, Keller and Hendricks faced criminal charges, their careers in ruins. Internal investigations uncovered deeper layers of corruption within the department, prompting major reforms. Grant, despite facing backlash from some peers, stood firm in her decision to expose the truth. A few days later, Elena met Grant at a quiet cafe. The younger officer hesitated before speaking. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Elena offered a small, knowing smile. "You earned this meeting." "Not many would have done what you did," Grant exhaled. "I just couldn't look the other way," Elena nodded. "And that's exactly why it matters." Weeks later, in a courtroom packed with reporters, Keller and Hendricks pleaded guilty to multiple charges. Their downfall sparked a wave of scrutiny over past cases, leading to further disciplinary action across the department. As Elena prepared for her next assignment, she reflected on the battle fought and won. Corruption was a hydra cut off one head, and another grew in its place. But as long as people like Grant existed, the fight for justice would never be in vain.